So if you change out your fuel pump and then now you're having problems with it, I thought I'd go over the most common issues that can happen and how you go about fixing it. And so what are some common problems? Well, first of all, you could have difficulty starting the engine. The engine might be running or idling rough. The fuel gauge might not be working properly, and you might be hearing odd noises. And so if any of these things are happening to you and you just change out the fuel pump, I'm going to go over all the main causes and how you can go about fixing it. And so the first thing, if possible, is to go get a fuel pressure test. And this is fairly easy to do. There's usually a connector on the fuel rail on most vehicles, not all, but most vehicles will have a connector on the fuel rail. And basically you just connect this fuel pressure gauge to it, and that can tell you a lot of information. You can look up what the engine's supposed to be running at and what the correct pressure is supposed to be when it is running. You can see what it's supposed to be when it's in the on position, and you can see what it does when you shut the engine off, that if it's holding pressure. And so if you could do this test, it could tell you a lot of information. If you don't have one of these gauges, most automotive stores will loan them out for like a deposit, or they'll rent them out or things like this. So if possible, it's always a good idea to do a fuel pressure test, because that can give you a lot of information on what's going on with the fuel system. And so the possible causes that happen after changing out a fuel pump is that there's a clogged fuel filter. And these can vary on where they're located. Sometimes they are located inside the gas tank with the fuel pump. If this happened and you just replace the fuel pump, hopefully you replace that fuel filter. But sometimes they are in line, and they'll be up and underneath the vehicle along the frame somewhere or something like that. And so if you do have a vehicle like this, go and locate it and replace that fuel filter, because this is very common. They become clogged up and they just cause issues. And so first thing on the list, if you have an inline fuel filter, go and replace it. Next up is just going to be a bad wiring connections. And basically there's just a bad connection, or one of these wires came loose when they got removed or something along these lines. So just go and examine all the wires and be sure all these connections and everything are tight and everything's good there, because the next thing on the list is going to be that something happened in the wiring and it just got a bad connection. The next thing to do is go check the fuse box, because sometimes these fuses do blow. There's also sometimes relays that turn on and off the fuel pump, and so you're going to want to go check that. It'll vary on how they're labeled, but usually inside the engine compartment there'll be a fuse box, and usually there's a fuse inside of there for the fuel pump, and quite often a relay. So for example, right here, it's labeled EFI. It'll be this 15 amp fuse. And it also has this relay right here labeled EFI. They can be labeled a little bit vague sometimes. It's really going to depend on the manufacturer. So you might have to Google it or research it a little bit to figure out which fuse is for the fuel pump on your particular vehicle. But next thing to do, go check for any blown fuses and possibly bad relay. And next up is going to be a bad fuel pressure regulator. Now, not all vehicles have a fuel pressure regulator, but many do. And so if yours does, then it's something you're going to want to check. And basically what the fuel pressure regulator does is it just holds pressure inside of the line so that the vehicle starts right up after it's been shut down. And so if you shut the vehicle off and it has really long start times, takes a long time to start, then you might have a bad fuel pressure regulator. One method to test the fuel pressure regulator is what you do is you take the key and you just go into the accessory or the on position. You don't start the engine, but you just turn the key until the fuel pump turns on. You let it run for 2 or 3 seconds, then you turn the key to the off position, and then you turn it back to the on position. You do this like 2 or 3 times. You basically want to build up fuel pressure inside the line, and then you try to start the vehicle. If the vehicle starts right up, then it's usually a bad fuel pressure regulator. And then if you let the vehicle sit, then all that fuel is going to drain back into the tank, and then it takes longer to start. So that's one method that you can go about testing to see if it has a bad fuel pressure regulator. But the next thing to go and check for is a bad fuel pressure regulator. And then another thing is that if your fuel gauge is not working, then a very common issue with this is going to be the little level that's at the bottom of the fuel pump and the little circuit board that it attaches to, and that some kind of bad connection or something happened here and it's just not working. So you might have to pull this back out to check for that. Be sure to check for any blown fuses and be sure all your connections are good at the top before you take it back out. But if the gas gauge was working before you replaced it and then now it's not working, then very likely it's down here inside this level or inside this circuit board that it attaches to. So if your fuel gauge isn't working, then this is what to check. And the last thing is just going to be that for some reason you got a bad fuel pump. And while this isn't very common, it can happen sometimes. The only way to really tell that is if you do a fuel pressure test on it. Since if you do a fuel pressure test, you should be getting the rated pressure out of that fuel pump that the vehicle's rated for. But last thing on the list is going to be a faulty fuel pump. And so that's basically it. I just wanted to do a video on some of the common problems that happen after a fuel pump gets changed out and how you go about fixing them. If you have anything to add, please comment down below. If you have any questions, ask me and I'll try to answer them. If this video helps you, please click like, please click subscribe, and have a good day.